I raised my son with my back bent and my hands always full, full of groceries, full of laundry, full of worry. When his father left, he was still small enough to fall asleep on my chest, his breathing soft and warm, like he trusted the world not to disappear. I learned early how to be quiet when I cried, how to stretch money until it felt like a skill, how to smile so he wouldn't feel the cracks under our feet. He used to sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, legs swinging, telling me about school. He laughed easily back then, a wide, careless laugh that filled the room. I can still hear it sometimes when the house is too quiet. He promised me things the way children do, with absolute certainty. "I'll take care of you when I'm older," he'd say, mouth full of cereal. I'd smile and tell him he already was. I worked 2 jobs when I had to. I missed sleep, I missed meals, I missed pieces of myself I didn't even notice leaving. But I never missed his school plays, even when I arrived in a wrinkled uniform. I never missed birthdays. I never missed the way his face searched for me in a crowd, relaxing only when he found me. When he got older, he changed in small ways first. He stopped telling me everything. Then he stopped asking my opinion. I told myself that was normal. Boys grow up. They pull away. That's what everyone says. Then he met her. He brought her home one Sunday afternoon. She stood in my doorway like she was already deciding whether I belonged in her world. She smiled, polite and tight, eyes moving quickly around the room. She took in the furniture, the worn rug, the old photos on the wall. "This is cozy," she said. I laughed softly. "It's been loved." She didn't laugh back. At dinner, she spoke about her family, their vacations, their traditions. She talked about venues and aesthetics and futures that sounded expensive just to imagine. My son watched her the way he used to watch me when he was little, like the room tilted toward her. I told myself not to be jealous. Mothers aren't supposed to compete. But something shifted that day. After they got engaged, wedding talk filled every conversation. Colors, flowers, guest lists, everything planned with precision. I offered help when I could. I suggested small things, things that mattered to me. Family traditions, songs, seating arrangements. "Oh," she'd say, smiling thinly, "we've already decided that." My son would avoid my eyes. When I asked about my role, he hesitated. "We'll figure something out, Mom." I didn't realize then how much that sentence would hurt later. As the wedding approached, I felt myself being slowly erased. Decisions made without me, conversations I wasn't included in. I found out details from other people before I heard them from my own son. When I mentioned it, he brushed it off. "You're overthinking," he said gently, the way people speak when they want you to stop talking. The week before the wedding, she called me. "We'll need you to help in the kitchen on the day," she said, like it was an honor, just to keep things running smoothly. I paused. "During the ceremony?" She laughed lightly. "Of course not. During the reception. It's better if you're busy." Busy. I looked around my small living room, at the photos of my son growing up taped into albums with worn corners. I thought of all the times I'd stood quietly behind the scenes, making things work so others could shine. "Yes," I said, "I can help." She sounded relieved. "Wonderful." She didn't thank me. The night before the wedding, I laid out my dress on the bed. It wasn't new, but it was clean and carefully pressed. I sat beside it and ran my fingers over the fabric, my chest tight with a feeling I didn't yet have a name for. I told myself I was proud. I told myself this was just how things went. But somewhere deep inside, something whispered that tomorrow would change everything. And it was right. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly, like it didn't want to disturb anything. I woke before my alarm, my heart already beating too fast. Outside, the sky was pale and uncertain, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the first time I held my son, how his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like they knew exactly where they belonged. I got dressed slowly. I brushed my hair twice, then once more, smoothing it back the way I always had for important days. I put on the dress I'd laid out the night before and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't look beautiful, but I looked like myself. That felt important. When I arrived at the venue, everything was already buzzing. People moved quickly, voices layered over one another, laughter bursting out in sharp little pieces. The place smelled like flowers and polish and something sweet baking somewhere far away. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking it all in, feeling strangely invisible. My son walked past me without seeing me at first. He looked handsome, taller than I remembered, his suit fitting him in a way that made my chest ache. When he finally noticed me, his face softened. "Mom," he said, hugging me briefly. Just briefly. "You made it." I smiled. Of course I did. He looked like he wanted to say more, but someone called his name and he was pulled away before I could ask anything. I watched him go, swallowed by people and plans. She found me near the seating area. "There you are," she said, glancing at her phone. "We're running a little behind." She handed me a small list. Instructions, times, where to stand, where not to stand. "The kitchen is through that door," she added, pointing without looking at me. "You'll be helping the caterers." I stared at her. "During the reception?" She smiled, quick and practiced. "It's better this way. Less chaos." Less chaos. I nodded slowly. All right. No one asked if I wanted to sit in the front row. No one asked if I wanted to walk down the aisle. I watched guests arrive, watched them laugh and take photos, watched other mothers being fussed over, their dresses adjusted, their hands held. I was guided through a side door. The kitchen was hot and loud. Metal clanged, voices shouted orders back and forth. The air was thick with steam and the smell of food. Someone handed me an apron without asking who I was. "Put that on," a woman said briskly. "We need help plating." I tied the apron around my waist with hands that shook just a little. As the ceremony began, I could hear faint music drifting through the walls. A familiar song, the one I used to hum to my son when he couldn't sleep. I froze, plate in my hands, my throat tightening. They were walking down the aisle, without me. I imagined him standing there, waiting. I imagined her dress, the way everyone would turn to look at her. I imagined the moment he would say his vows, the words I once taught him to speak. My vision blurred. I blinked hard and kept working. Forks, plates, napkins. My hands moved on instinct, while my heart stayed somewhere else entirely. "Hurry up," someone snapped. "Table 12 needs more." I nodded and carried the tray, my legs steady, even though something inside me felt like it was folding on itself. I laughed once, softly, at the absurdity of it all. Look at me, the woman who raised the groom, hidden behind swinging doors. When the applause erupted from the other side of the wall, I knew it was done. Married, just like that. Later, during the reception, I was allowed out briefly to refill water pitchers. I saw my son across the room, laughing, his arm around his wife. He looked happy, truly happy. I waited for him to look for me. He didn't. I returned to the kitchen before anyone could see the tears spilling down my face. They fell silently, landing on the counter, disappearing as quickly as they came. I wiped them away with the back of my hand and kept going. Something shifted in me then. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, colder. A realization settling in slowly, heavily. I had been placed where I wouldn't be seen. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. But I knew one thing with frightening clarity. I would not leave this day unchanged. The kitchen had no windows, just bright lights that made everything look flat and unreal, like I'd stepped into a place where time didn't matter. Plates slid past me, orders were shouted, someone laughed loudly behind me, the kind of laugh that fills space without caring who it pushes aside. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. I replayed everything in my head while I worked, the way she'd smiled when she handed me the list, the way my son hadn't asked where I was during the ceremony, the way no one questioned why the groom's mother was carrying trays instead of sitting at a table. It wasn't anger that settled in my chest, it was clarity. I realized I had been quiet for years. Quiet when my suggestions were dismissed. Quiet when my calls went unanswered. Quiet when my presence became inconvenient. I'd told myself that love meant patience, that motherhood meant stepping back gracefully. But standing there with my hands smelling of lemon and soap, something inside me straightened its spine. I remembered a different kitchen, the one where my son used to sit on the counter, swinging his legs while I cooked dinner after long shifts. He'd ask 100 questions. He'd tell me about his day. He'd watch me like I was doing something magical just by keeping us fed. That kitchen had taught me something important. You don't survive by being invisible. I stepped away for a moment, claiming I needed the restroom. No one questioned me. I stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. My reflection in the metal surface of a door looked older than I felt, tired, but there was something else there now, something steadier. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I hadn't planned anything, not really, but I knew things I'd learned by listening when no one thought I mattered. Over the past months, I'd overheard conversations, phone calls she took loudly in my living room, complaints whispered with wine in hand. I knew about the money they'd borrowed from family to pay for the wedding. I knew about the promises made. I knew which accounts were tied to whose name. And I knew one more thing. I was the quiet cosigner on more than one piece of their perfect plan. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I'd been told it was temporary, a formality, something easily undone. But standing there, hearing music and laughter through the walls while I was hidden away like a shameful secret, I realized how much trust I'd handed over without question. I went back into the kitchen and finished my tasks calmly. I smiled when spoken to. I nodded. I thanked people who didn't know my name. Inside, something was settling into place. When the cake was being prepared, I was asked to help steady one of the tiers. My hands were steady as stone. The cake was beautiful, white, perfect, fragile, just like the image they'd built. As the speeches began in the other room, I could hear muffled applause, laughter, cheers. I wondered if anyone would mention me. I wondered if my son would thank me for anything, for the years, for the sacrifices, for the woman who had made his life possible. I knew the answer before it came. I laughed quietly to myself. Of course. When the final plates were cleared and the kitchen began to empty, I untied the apron and folded it neatly. I placed it on the counter like it was something borrowed, not something I belonged to. Before leaving the room, I made one phone call. My voice was calm, polite, almost cheerful. "Yes," I said, "I'd like to confirm something." I listened. I thanked them and ended the call. No shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic scene. That wasn't my style. I stepped back into the reception hall just as the dancing started. Lights flashed, music thumped. Everyone looked happy, drunk on celebration and certainty. My son saw me then, really saw me. "Mom," he said, surprised, "there you are." I smiled at him, a real smile, one that didn't ask for anything. "I'm right here," I said. He hugged me quickly, distracted, already turning back to his bride. I watched them dance, watched her head rest against his shoulder, watched the future they believed was already secured. I felt no urge to interrupt. Some lessons land best after the music stops. I left quietly that night. No one noticed, the way they were used to. As I walked out, the cool air hit my face, and I laughed softly, breath shaking just a little. Not because I was cruel, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood something powerful. I didn't need to be loud to be heard, and tomorrow their perfect plans would begin to unravel, not with drama, but with the kind of truth that doesn't ask permission. The morning after the wedding felt different. Not later, not heavier, just stripped of illusion. I woke early, as I always did, and sat at the small table in my kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. My phone lay face up beside it, silent. I knew it wouldn't stay that way. By mid-morning, the first call came. It was my son. "Mom," he said, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice, "did you make a call last night?" I smiled faintly into my tea. "I made a few over the years," I said. "Which one are you asking about?" There was a pause.
I could hear breathing on the other end, quick and tight. "The bank called," he said. "They said something about guarantees being withdrawn." "Yes," I replied. "That would be correct." His voice rose. "Why would you do that? Do you have any idea what this does to us?" I closed my eyes, not to escape the moment, but to stay steady inside it. "I know exactly what it does," I said. "I was told they were temporary, a formality. I was also told I wouldn't be affected." Another pause, longer this time. "They're saying we need to cover the gap immediately," he said. "The venue, the catering, the honeymoon package. The things you planned without me," I said quietly. He swallowed. I could hear it. "You didn't say anything," he said. "I did, just not loudly." By the afternoon, the calls multiplied. His wife called, once, twice, then a third time. I let it ring, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted her to sit with the silence for a while, the same silence she'd placed me in behind those kitchen doors. When I finally answered, her voice was tight, controlled, every word measured. "This isn't the time for misunderstandings," she said. "We're under a lot of pressure." "So was I replied. She exhaled sharply. "You embarrassed us." I laughed, a short sound that surprised even me. "Huh, no," I said. "You embarrassed yourselves. I simply stepped out of the way." She went quiet. "We need you to fix this," she said finally. I looked around my kitchen, at the chipped mug, the sunlight on the counter, at the life I'd built without spectacle or applause. "I'm done fixing things," I said. That evening, my son came to see me. He stood in my doorway the way he had as a teenager when he'd broken something and didn't know how to explain it. His suit was gone. He looked tired, smaller. "We didn't mean to hurt you," he said. I gestured for him to sit. "You didn't mean to include me either," I replied. He ran his face over his hands. "She thought it would be simpler." "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. I told him everything then. Not angrily, not dramatically. I told him how it felt to hear the ceremony music through a wall, how it felt to carry plates while strangers toasted his happiness, how it felt to realize that being his mother had become an inconvenience. He cried, not loudly, just tears slipping down his face as he stared at the floor. I didn't see it. That, I replied, was the problem. The wedding photos were still being posted online. Smiles, champagne, a perfect beginning. But behind the scenes, invoices piled up, calls went unanswered, promises made in confidence were suddenly real. I didn't gloat. I didn't watch closely. I simply stayed where I was, letting the truth do its quiet work. A week later, they came together, not dressed for display, not standing tall. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded and poured tea. They apologized, carefully, in pieces. She spoke about stress, expectations, pressure. He spoke about being pulled in two directions and choosing wrong. I listened. When they finished, I said, "I don't need apologies that sound rehearsed." They both looked at me. "I need respect, not as the groom's mother, not as someone useful, as a person." She nodded, eyes damp. He reached for my hand. "I forgot who built me," he said. I squeezed his fingers once. "You remembered just in time." The plans they'd made didn't fully recover. Some losses stayed, some dreams were scaled back. Their marriage began not in perfection, but in reckoning. And as for me, I slept better than I had in months, because for the first time, I hadn't swallowed myself to keep the peace.
Time didn't fix everything. It never does. But it softened the sharpest edges, the way water smooths stones without asking permission. The weeks after the wedding passed without celebration. No glowing posts, no delayed honeymoon, just ordinary days that forced honesty into the open, whether anyone wanted it there or not. My son came by often, not with excuses anymore, just with himself.
He helped around the house without being asked, fixed the loose cabinet hinge, took out the trash, small things that spoke louder than apologies. Sometimes we sat in silence, drinking coffee, the way we used to when he was younger and words weren't always necessary. His wife came too, though less frequently at first. When she did, she seemed unsure where to place herself, like the ground beneath her had shifted and she hadn't learned the new balance yet. She watched me carefully, as if expecting judgment to fall at any moment. It never did. One afternoon, she stood in my kitchen and said quietly, "I thought strength looked like control." I kept chopping vegetables, the steady rhythm calming. "It usually does," I said, "until it doesn't." She nodded, staring at her hands. I didn't know how much space I was taking. "I did," I replied, "but you never asked." She looked up then, eyes wet but clear. "I'm asking now." That mattered more than she probably understood. They didn't rebuild the wedding they'd imagined. The debt forced them to simplify. The image cracked, and something more honest took its place. They argued more openly. They listened more carefully. They learned, the hard way, that partnership isn't about presentation. One evening, my son stayed late. We washed dishes together, standing side by side, our movements easy again. "I thought love meant choosing her over everyone else," he said suddenly. I rinsed a plate and set it aside. "Love means not erasing where you came from to prove where you're going." He leaned against the counter, nodding slowly. "I was afraid of disappointing her." "And you forgot disappointing me didn't feel safer," I said gently. He smiled sadly. "You never yelled." "I never had to," I said. Months later, they invited me to dinner. Just the three of us. No audience, no agenda. She cooked. The food wasn't perfect. The conversation wandered. At one point, she laughed so hard at something my son said that she had to wipe tears from her face. It was unguarded, real. As I watched them, I realized something surprising. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace. When they walked me to my car that night, my son hugged me tightly, longer than he had in years. "I see you now," he whispered. I believed him. Sometimes I think about that wedding day, the clatter of dishes, the heat of the kitchen, the music bleeding through walls meant to keep me out. I think about the woman I was that morning, standing quietly in her dress, hoping not to make trouble. And I'm grateful for her, because she carried me to the moment when I stopped shrinking. I didn't ruin their plans the way people imagine ruin. There was no shouting, no spectacle, no scene that could be retold for entertainment. I simply removed myself from being used. I let consequences speak, and they listened. Now, when I sit at my table in the evening, the house feels full again. Not because of noise or celebration, but because I am fully here, unhidden, unapologetic. Dignity, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It clears its throat quietly and waits to be noticed.